Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next OpenUK Future Leaders training. Today we are joined by speaker Dawn Foster, who is in charge of open source software community strategy at VMware. A little bit of an introduction about the Future Leaders group of OpenUK. We are a collection of individuals who are interested in open technologies, including open source software, open hardware, and open data. It includes a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, coding, and innovation. And it does include both private practice lawyers and in-house counsel that work in the technology sector and related fields. We operate under the direction of the OpenUK Legal and Policy Committee, and we have a purpose to bring together and develop future leaders in legal policy matters relating to open technology and support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. The Future Leaders Group is currently co-chaired by me, Robert Grinnells. I'm from Phil Fisher, a law firm in London, and Katie Gibson, who's also from a law firm called Bristow's, and we're both lawyers advising on technology and commercial matters. The group is always open to new ideas and new members, whether getting involved in all of our activities or just dipping in and out of our various projects, like these training sessions today. And I'm delighted to say that we have Dawn Foster here today, as I said earlier, from VMware, who is Director of Open Source Community Strategy. And I'll hand over to you, Dawn. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. So welcome everybody to my talk about open source collaboration. I would encourage you, if I don't need to wait to the end for questions, so feel free to just chime in and interrupt if you have some questions along the way, because I did leave plenty of time for questions. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. First, I'll tell you a little bit about me. So I've spent more than 20 years working in the technology industry. And for most of that time, I've been working on open source projects from within a wide variety of companies. I've been director of community at Puppet. I've been community lead for Intel's Open Source Technology Center. I also have a PhD from the University of Greenwich in London that I got by researching how people working at many different companies collaborate within the Linux kernel. I'm currently, as we mentioned earlier, working in VMware's open source program office. I'm responsible for our open source community strategy. I'm also a board member of OpenUK, which, as you know, is focused on developing and sustaining leadership in open technology, which is very exciting. I'm a governing board member and maintainer for the Linux Foundation's Chaos project, which is focused on using metrics to evaluate the health of open source projects. And I'm also on the advisory board for Bachelor, which is a company that builds open source project health dashboards. Now, my work within open source software has been focused both on growing participation in company-driven open source projects like Puppet and in helping our employees collaborate within large foundation-driven projects like the work I've been doing at Pivotal and now VMware within Kubernetes and other ecosystem projects. Before we dive into talking about how your company and your employees should collaborate in open source projects, let's talk a little bit about how collaboration works within open source projects and the complex interactions between individuals, companies, and communities. While there are a few exceptions, contributions to most open source projects are centered around the individual. Contributions come from individuals rather than companies, and when someone submits a pull request to fix a bug, add a feature, or maybe update some documentation in an open source project, that change usually comes from an individual. Commits usually include a name and an email address, but in many cases, unless the person uses their corporate email address, you can't even tell where the person works. To make this even more complicated for companies, in most open source projects, the leadership positions stay with the individual if that person changes jobs. This means that an employee can take their leadership position in a project right with them to the next job. So companies are really well served to make sure that these people are happy, they're well compensated, and they enjoy their work. In some projects, like the Linux kernel, there is no direct way for companies to participate, other than by dedicating time from individual employees who contribute on behalf of the company, which is becoming increasingly common. When I worked at Intel, we had entire teams of people who worked full-time on open source projects like the Linux kernel, Android, KVM, and a bunch of others. We have something similar at VMware, where we have people working full-time on open source projects like Spring, RabbitMQ, Kubernetes, the Linux kernel, and a bunch of other projects. And if you aren't sure how to contribute as a company, you might be able to hire an existing contributor or possibly even a maintainer as an employee to do work on the project on your behalf. In addition to devoting time from your employees to the project, companies are also in a position to help open source projects by providing additional resources. Open source projects need funding or in-kind sponsorship for loads of things like infrastructure, legal representation. And they also appreciate sponsorships for events and other activities. And I'll talk more about all of these later since corporate involvement in open source is indeed the main focus for this presentation. Open source communities include a wide variety of individuals who are all working together within open source projects. When I talk about community, I'm including all of the people who work on the project. This includes core product developers, release managers, quality assurance, localization, and other people who contribute to the project itself. Application developers who are using the API and other features to write applications, modules, or extensions that build on top of your project. Users, the people who actually run your software and with any luck provide some feedback occasionally. People working for vendors and companies who are creating their products based on your project. Other contributors include people working on promotion, organizing meetups, doing moderation, documentation, and a whole bunch of other thankless tasks. And some of these people contribute as part of their day job on behalf of an employer, while others contribute in their free time. And they're all important parts of the community. In open source communities, I have also had so many small world moments where people that I've worked with in past projects pop up again and again in other communities that I'm part of. It's important to keep in mind that you're likely to run into these same individuals again and again, so be thoughtful and kind when working with others. If you are a big jerk in one community, it is likely that other people will remember this, and they will bring your reputation with them into new projects, which can reflect badly on you and your company. And as an employer, it's worth doing a fair bit of due diligence to see how someone has behaved in previous open source communities before having them do any work on your behalf. Now that we have a better idea of how collaboration works for open source projects and companies, next up, we'll talk about how to build a contribution strategy and plans for participating in open source projects. The most important part of putting together strategies and plans for your open source contributions is aligning them with the overall business goals for your entire company. If your open source engagements do not support the overall strategies for your organization, you will drastically reduce the chance of being successful. By taking some time and effort to make sure you support that overall corporate strategy, then it will be much easier to justify continuing these efforts during the next planning cycle for your organization. On the other hand, when your goals are not clearly aligned with the overall strategy, people will just look at your open source participation as something that can be cut or starved of resources. And this will also help you make the case to senior management and company executives who are not likely to be involved in the low-level details. Explaining how your open source contributions support the goals of the company can help the exec team understand the importance of the work. And while some employees might see collaborating on open source software to be its own reward, having a solid strategy can also help employees understand how their open source work contributes to the success of the company. As an employee, I think it's really nice to see that the work that I'm doing has an impact and meaningfully contributes to helping the company achieve their goals. One of the other things you'll need to decide is which projects you should be contributing to. Well, this may sound really easy, right? You can just contribute to the open source projects you use. But if you're like every company I have ever worked for, this is likely to be hundreds, if not thousands of projects. And you aren't likely to have the people to contribute to all of them. And for many of the big, complex open source projects like Linux or Kubernetes, You probably also need to think about which part of the project you should contribute to. And this is where thinking about company strategy comes in again. Which of these open source projects are strategic in some way for your company? Maybe there are some projects that your operations team uses to run some of your critical business infrastructure. Are there any development or deployment tools that impact your ability to release the products that generate revenue for your organization? Is there other software that's important to your ability to deliver customer-facing products or services? All of these, among loads of other things, should be considered when deciding which open source projects your employees should participate in. You should also have a look at where you've already contributed to open source projects. In some cases, you might have employees who've already fixed bugs or added new features or functionality to an open source project to meet some company requirement or need in the past. Now, after you've decided which projects to support, you need to figure out what resources will be required. Now, as I mentioned earlier, companies contribute to open source projects by having employees participate and collaborate within those projects. So you need to figure out how many people you need for each project and what skills are required for those people. In some cases, you might have employees with the skills you need who have already contributed to open source projects in the past, which makes for a really good starting point for new contributions. But the thing to keep in mind is that contributing to open source projects might require some different skills than participating in internal projects. These people need to be really comfortable in very ambiguous environments where they are going to receive feedback, possibly difficult or negative feedback, and they will be expected to respond to this feedback in the public in a professional manner. And keep in mind that not every engineer wants their work to be in the public spotlight, which can feel like being under a microscope sometimes. And if you don't have the skills internally, you might be able to find existing contributors that you can just hire. But you need to be a bit careful about this option too, because you don't want to get a reputation within an open source project for aggressively poaching employees from other companies. So it requires a bit of nuance to make it known that you're interested in hiring people to work on an open source project without aggressively hiring them away from other companies or other employers. And in some projects, you can gain additional influence in a project by sponsoring or becoming a member. For example, companies who join the Hyperledger project at the premier highest level get to appoint a person to the governing board, among other benefits. That's a really pricey option. And many open source projects, a lot of them do not have any option where you can pay for influence. But you do see this in some open source projects that are focused on more corporate concerns. So it might be worth exploring if you want to be heavily involved in a project where that's an option for you. You should also think about what guidelines or processes you might want to put in place to help people engage in open source projects in ways that work well for your organization. These often contain guidance about licensing, avoiding accidental disclosure of confidential information, maybe some internal review processes. But my caution about guidelines and processes is that they can be written in ways that actively discourage contributions, especially when they heavily use really scary legal jargon with an emphasis on how you're going to punish people for when things go wrong. Instead, you're often better off writing the guidelines in ways that help engineers understand what you need them to do and why, and language that can be really easily understood by anybody. And bonus points for actually making it easy for your employees to contribute to these open source projects. And if you're planning to have a lot of open source collaboration across many projects, then it probably makes sense to build an open source program office to help you manage the processes and to be a resource for your contributors where they can get help and get guidance. In a lot of cases, open source program offices start with a single person and then grow from there as needed. So they can be pretty flexible. And you may or may not need it, depending on what you're doing and the scope of your efforts. Now, as with any good strategy and plans, the outcome and results should be measurable. so that you can tell whether your efforts were successful. Now, personally, I love data, so measuring open source project success is kind of a hobby for me, and it's something that I am super passionate about. So I tend to get a lot of questions about it. Usually, the questions are focused on how to decide what to measure. And I think that's really sort of the wrong question to start with. And my answer is always the same. It depends. What you measure depends on what you're trying to achieve, which is why this slide is in the strategy and planning section of this presentation. But ultimately, you need to look at your strategies and your plans to come up with criteria that will help you measure whether or not you're successful. For example, if you want to improve the performance of a particular piece of open source software, you'll want to have success criteria and measurement based on specific types of performance. Measuring the number of commits you make to the project is not going to help you decide whether or not something performs better after your involvement. But if you want to gain influence within an open source project, maybe you do want to measure increases in contributions or the number of employees who are moving into positions of influence like maintainership within the project. But once you figure out this criteria, you need to make sure that you can actually get the data that's required to measure it and start measuring it now to get a good baseline. There are loads of tools available to gather contribution data about open source projects. Some of the commonly used tools can be found in the Linux Foundation's CHAOSS project. And many big projects already have dashboards using these tools and others to display contribution data for the project. I also recommend maybe over measuring a little bit and gathering as much data as you can about your participation so that if your strategy shifts in the future, you're more likely to have some baseline data to start out with. And having some extra data can also help you investigate other ideas for how you might want to improve your participation in the project, or it might help you diagnose issues if you see some issues within the project. Okay, so now that we've figured out what you want to do, let's talk about how to do it while being a good corporate citizen and avoid some common but embarrassing mistakes. First step, obviously, is to join. Each project is different, so what you need to do to join the community will vary, but this can usually be found by having a look at the website or the documentation, and it's typically found in either contributor or community documentation. Usually this would include maybe some type of mailing list, IRC, Slack, other communication channels. You'll also want to find the repositories where the source code can be found and start to have a look at it to get the feel for the structure and typical contributions. These days, a lot of it's on GitHub, but not all of it. Some places have their repositories on GitLab or other tools. And you'll also want to have a close look at the project documentation, especially the contribution docs. Spend whatever time it takes to fully understand the contribution guidelines, the code of conduct, and other expectations for collaboration within the project. The expectations for contributors are different for each project, so don't assume you know how to contribute, even if you have experience with other open source software contributions. I also recommend taking the time to lurk in the community and understand how people participate. I have seen way too many overeager new community members jump into the community with both feet. They make mistakes by violating community norms, talking about things that aren't relevant, and just generally sort of making a mess of things. Now, everybody makes mistakes at some point, but some of them really can be avoided by taking the time to learn about the community rather than just sort of barging in and trying to be an active participant from day one. Don't be afraid to sit back while you learn from other community members. By taking the time to observe and lurk for a bit, you can learn about how people behave and get a feel for how people typically respond. When you've spent some time understanding the expectations and how to contribute, you should start with something small. I've seen companies spend a ton of time working on huge new features internally, and then they dump them into the community as one massive contribution that no one was expecting. In many cases, this is a waste of time for everyone involved since the contribution is unlikely to be aligned with the project goals or the contribution expectations. The company and employees will have wasted time contributing to something that may require a ton of rework or never be accepted at all. And the maintainers will need to spend a bunch of time reviewing it and explaining why certain parts of it, or even worse, all of it, aren't acceptable. Better off starting with some small things, like little bug fixes, to learn about the contribution process first. Once you start participating, you should expect feedback. Sometimes this feedback will be kind, other times not so much. And as much as you might want to just fire back at people, you're only likely to start a flame war, which is going to reflect badly on you as an individual and badly on your employer. It's better in the long run to wait to respond until you can cool off a bit and maybe take the high ground. And even when the feedback is harsh, there will be things you'll need to do to rework your contribution to make it acceptable. So you should try to stay focused on what changes you need to make in your contribution. And in some cases, you might have to have hard discussions with people about the merits of your contribution. But you can focus on the problem, deliver it with a bit of kindness while avoiding any attacks on the other person. It can also help to have someone else read your response before you post it publicly to help catch any issues with tone that might make you sound more harsh than you think you will. This is an incredibly difficult line to walk sometimes, but staying professional and being kind to other people while responding to difficult feedback can make a big difference to your personal reputation and the reputation of your employer within these open source communities. In many cases, especially when you're new to a community, you should expect to iterate on the feedback. After you submit your changes to accommodate the first wave of feedback, you're likely to get more feedback on those changes. So just consider it an iterative process. This also means that you should plan for the time it takes to get multiple waves of feedback. Submitting something at the last minute before a release window closes and expecting it to just be included is going to be frustrating for everyone involved. So give yourself plenty of time for these multiple feedback and resubmit processes. As I mentioned before, the expectations for contributors really are different for each project. So don't assume you know how to contribute, even if you have experience with other open source projects. Always, and I really do mean always, read the contribution guidelines before you make your contribution. For this first step, step one, there can be some paperwork required. It isn't unusual for projects to require some sort of contributor license agreement signature, which is often implemented just as a simple click-through agreement that must be done before you can submit your contribution. And while this may seem really straightforward, it can get complicated if you're employed by a company, which might have special requirements for these types of agreements or contributions, depending on your employment contract and the companies involved. This whole process is way easier if the project uses a signed off by process, which is also referred to as a developer certificate of origin. And there are special ways of adding this to your commit. So again, have a close look at the contributor guidelines to see what kind of paperwork is required. The next step is submit your contribution. And again, the process varies widely by project. So the most common way of submitting to most projects is to submit a GitHub pull request or a GitLab merge request. They're kind of the same thing, depending on the tools used by the project. But how you do this varies on their specific requirements and processes. For example, they may expect you to submit contributions to a specific branch, or they may want you to squash your commits before merging, or they may not want you to squash your commits before merging. And there are also many other projects and other tools with different types of submit processes. And some projects, like the Linux kernel, expect you to submit patches with diffs to mailing lists. So again, read the contribution docs to understand exactly what you need to do to submit your contribution to the specific project. Now, on the previous slide, I talked about reviews and feedback along with resubmitting. So that's the fourth step in the contribution process. So I won't go into that in more detail other than to say this is kind of where it fits in the process. And then finally is the celebration step, where your contribution is merged. It's included in the project source code. Your part is pretty much done unless you have to maintain it later. But the merge step is performed by an existing trusted project member, someone with commit or approval access within the portion of the project where your contribution resides. Keep in mind, at this point, your contribution is only included in the source code, but not necessarily into a release. So you might have to wait until the next release cycle for your contribution to be widely available for people to actually use it. And as you might have already guessed, again, the release processes vary by project. So this might be a few days, it might be many months, depending on the project. After you get those first few small contributions and you've worked through the process, you want to make sure that you spend time discussing proposed changes in the community before you start making them. By talking about contributions very early in the process, you can get feedback on ways to architect the changes so that they will be consistent with the expectations of the project. You can also learn about anyone else who might be working in similar areas to help avoid conflicting changes that won't work together when they're merged into the project. And these discussions also avoid surprising people, especially for new features or other really big changes. It can also help to break these big changes into several smaller, easier to digest contributions. It is a lot easier for maintainers to find the time to provide feedback on smaller contributions. And it gives you time to make corrections if anything you're doing just isn't quite right. And it allows you to iterate on the feedback through several contributions, making it less likely that you'll have bigger issues. It's also important to keep in mind that you don't really have any control whatsoever over other participants in the project. This is different from working within a company where you can escalate issues to managers who can work to resolve problems with non-responsive employees. In open source projects, you don't have a strict chain of command or other ways to exert control over the people you collaborate with. Instead, you should strive to be kind and easy to work with, since you may need to find other ways to influence people to respond to your patches or pull requests. Given the pandemic, I thought about pulling the slide out, but I think it's important for us to talk about because I think it will continue to be important with virtual events and continue to be important over time and when this is all over and eventually we're allowed to, go to events again. But a lot of the work that we do in open source projects is based on the relationships that we have with other people. My PhD research was based on collaboration in the Linux kernel, and as part of that research, I interviewed a bunch of kernel developers. And all of the interviews, they talked about the importance of their relationships with other people. Almost all of them talked about how existing relationships made it easier to collaborate with others. All of the people that I interviewed mentioned in-person collaboration at conferences and meetings as something that was important. People talked about how it was sometimes easier to work through really difficult, big issues at conferences. It's easier to communicate with someone online if you've met them before and maybe shared a meal or a drink or just had a nice conversation at an event. Knowing the human being on the other side of the keyboard can make a bigger difference than what you might realize. Now, if your employees are working on open source projects, then you should see if there are any conferences where large numbers of other community members attend, and even virtual conferences. By having key employees attend those conferences or project meetings, they can build deeper, lasting relationships with others that will benefit both your company and your other employees. I've spent a lot of time at open source conferences over the years, and I have deep, lasting connections with people that I've met at those events. And now, when I need to do something new or I have a question, I usually know someone who can point me in the right direction. And I often make introductions for other employees to people outside of the company who can help us learn something new or maybe solve some tricky issue. Upstreaming your patches also helps you become a good corporate citizen, but it also has quite a few internal benefits for your company. If you aren't familiar with upstreaming, this just means that when you make patches to fix a bug or solve some internal need, that you submit those patches back into the open source project rather than continuing to maintain them internally. Because when you maintain patches internally, every time the open source project releases fixes or other updates, you need to go through the work of reapplying your patches and even possibly rewriting some of your patches if they touch bits of the code that were changed in the update. The side effect of the sometimes difficult process is that people tend to put off applying updates, which can be a big problem if those updates contain critical security fixes. And while it does take more time up front to submit patches into the upstream, you're better off taking the time to submit these patches into the open source project where they can be properly maintained as a part of the project and where other people can benefit from them as well. And the easier you make it for your employees to contribute these changes back into open source projects, the better off you'll be as a company. And in general, upstreaming patches is just sort of considered the right thing to do in open source projects, which will help maintain your company's status as a good open source corporate citizen. Understanding maintenance expectations is also a big part of being a good corporate citizen. Putting large chunks of code into an open source project, disappearing, poof, and expecting someone else to maintain it reflects very poorly on your organization. Now, if you fix a small bug or make minor changes, it's unlikely that you'll be expected to maintain those changes over the long term, since someone else is likely responsible for maintaining that thing that you just made a small fix to. Where you really need to think about this is when you're making large contributions, like a new feature or a new driver. And you need to make sure that your employees are planning to maintain the code over the long term before you contribute it into an open source project. If you want to open source a project because it has no users, it's old, it's crusty, and you don't want to maintain it anymore, please, 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 just don't do this. Dumping your project into the open source community and hoping that someone else will be just dying to take it over and help you out is at best a wee bit naive, and it generally makes your company look bad. So make sure that you're open sourcing the project for the right reasons. For example, a desire to collaborate with other people and innovate on your project is a good reason to open source it. If a project will need to integrate with a bunch of other technologies, open sourcing it can make it easier for people to help you integrate it with technologies that you're less familiar with. As I mentioned earlier, your company needs to be prepared to maintain the project over the long term, just as you would with something you released under a proprietary license. This will take time and it'll take resources, so you really have to plan for that. Where I see companies underestimate the amount of effort required is usually related to the time it takes to collaborate with the community. You need to have people available to answer questions, discuss new features, and provide feedback on new contributions. Every company I have ever worked for has struggled at one point or another to manage incoming pull requests for open source projects, since it takes quite a bit of time to evaluate those contributions and provide people with good feedback. And the people working on pull requests need to be comfortable providing tough feedback. The reality is that some pull requests will contain poor quality code or possibly never be merged because of fundamental conflicts with the direction of the projects. It's easy to ignore these and hope they go away. They won't. But a pile of neglected pull requests just make you look like a bad corporate citizen. It's important that employees respond to these in a way that's clear about the future of the contribution, but also shows empathy and appreciation for the hard work that someone put into that contribution. And while it's tough and not always entirely realistic to keep up with everything, keeping up with pull requests shows that you care about the community and really helps with your good corporate citizen standing. Here are a few resources that people might find useful. The To-Do group has a bunch of guides that are useful for open source program offices, and they have specific guides for starting open source projects and recruiting developers. GitHub also has a bunch of really good guides, and these are not guides for using GitHub. They have guides about starting open source projects, about building welcoming communities, about best practices for maintainers. OpenSource.com also has a bunch of frequently asked questions and guides, including how to promote your project, building community, and licensing. And these are all really great starting points for getting ideas about how to improve your open source projects. And with that, I will say thank you and open it up for questions.
Hello, hi Dawn. It's Sammy from ARM. Really good talk. So thank you for taking the time. A couple of things actually on relationships. I totally agree with you. I think relationships are really important in terms of building expertise. I remember I personally the first time I attended an open source conference many years ago. I was sort of overwhelmed by the level of expertise that people around me at that time had, whereas you feel, where do I start? So I think it is important when building relationships to think about those who are new, and of course venues like this with the future leaders is really great because you sort of get the younger generation to build relationships and then hopefully attend conferences, etc. So that I just wanted to sort of highlight how critical that is. The other thing is mentoring, because again, mentoring sort of those new in the field is really sponsoring them very, very important in terms of getting them sort of to.
I just lost Sammy. Can other people still
Yeah,
hear
we
him?
just lost Sammy there, unfortunately.
While we're waiting for him to come back, if it's okay,
Yeah.
I think I'm going to pick up on exactly what he was saying before I asked my question. So he was talking about mentoring. I don't know if he was going to ask you a question, but I violently agree with him that mentoring is critical. And within the Legal and Policy and Future Leaders Group, they are undertaking a project to review government terms and conditions, being mentored by a number of, I'll use the term senior instead of old lawyers. Do you have any advice for either the mentors or the mentees and how that works based on your community experience and collaboration? I know there's some concerns about consistency and how having little pockets of people working together will work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I also agree that mentoring is really, really important and is really critical. I mean, I owe a lot of my success to people like Denise Cooper, who back in the day we both worked at Intel, and she started sort of dragging me along with her to give, to be on panels at conferences and give presentations. And I feel like that mentorship from her and that involvement and kind of, tagging along on her coattails really helped my career in ways that I never possibly could have anticipated. And so I think things like that are really important. And I've also tried to give back in that same way by doing, panels and joint presentations and bringing people who are, some newer voices and help give visibility to other people so that hopefully they can, feel some of the same way that I felt back in that day. But I think also that projects themselves can do a lot with sort of more structured mentoring programs. So if I look at Kubernetes, which is a project that I'm involved in, one of the things that they do a really good job of in certain portions of the project is that they have people leading things, and then they have people shadowing those leaders. And the idea is that those shadows will eventually become the leader moving forward. And they do that for a lot of things that happen pretty quickly, so release processes. So for every Kubernetes release, there are, I think, more than a dozen leads for various portions of the release. And each of those leads has 2 or 3 shadows with them. And so the shadows help them with the work. The shadows see what it means to be the leader for that particular portion of the project, and then they can decide if they want to, in the next release, do the same thing. And we've done a similar thing for the contributor summits. So we have people leading specific areas for the Kubernetes contributor summits, and then we have people shadowing those leaders, and then they eventually become leaders themselves. So I think there's a lot you can do with mentoring programs in ways that are a little more structured than just sort of, talking to people occasionally and getting kind of one-on-one mentorship.
Thank you, Don. I'm sorry, I have a bit of a flaky connection today, but yeah, I think you've answered what I was going to ask. How do you go about the mentoring? But I was also going to add, I personally to this day make it a mission in every event that I attend that I go and talk to one other person that I've never met before. And use that as a strategy of sort of expanding the network. You talked about relationships and networks. So that's something I personally found was really successful. You talked about going for a drink and just having a chat with somebody. Great. We all have some free time when we attend these conferences. So just take a huge advantage of that free time and get to know new people that you haven't sort of met before. Of course, that doesn't mean that you forget about the people that you know, but you can do both. The other thing I think in that one specifically is don't hesitate to introduce people to others that you might know. Really very important. I certainly found that was really helpful for me in my early years when I started to have more involvement with open source. The other thing I wanted to comment on was the phrase dumping of projects. I think that's a really difficult one because sometimes organizational strategy changes, so it's inevitable that interest in a particular area may no longer be feasible. So for me, I would choose to sort of use the term plan the retirement of a particular project or the handover of the project. That is much more critical, and be upfront, make it clear that the reasons behind why you can no longer maintain a particular project. Perhaps you don't have any resources. Perhaps it is. Its company strategy has changed and shifted, so be upfront about those to ensure adequate handover happens. I agree with you. Just dumping code over the line and sort of hope somebody else will take it on is not great. Even if you know that you're not going to be using it or requiring it any further, I think it's important to do an appropriate handover.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I only use the term dumping when I'm talking about literally just like dumping it. The real solution, hopefully your project has users and other contributors and you can have sort of a graceful transition to other people. And that's that's sort of the ideal situation. In the case where you really don't have users and nobody cares about the project anymore, and I work at VMware, and we have a really structured process around what to do in those cases. And we sunset them, we archive them. The code gets redirected to somewhere else, and we do that in a way that's very transparent, and we talk about it. And I think that's important. Rather than dumping it, you should have some sort of actual transition plan and do it in a way that is beneficial for the community and not detrimental.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you.
Yeah. And on your point, I just want to get back to the point that you made earlier about introducing yourself to new people at conferences. That's one of the things. There are a few of us that get together at open source summits and various other conferences, people like Nithya Ruff and a few other people. And one of the things that we do try to do is, if we get together for dinners, we do lots of lunches and dinners together at these conferences. And we do often sort of look for people who don't have anything to do. People who are new to the conference, don't really know people, and we often just invite them along and just come have dinner with us, and we'll end up with a group of like 6 or 8 people, of which a lot of us know each other, and then there'll be 1 or 2 people who are new, and it gives them an opportunity to interact with a few people and kind of get the conference started off on the right note, because hopefully they'll
I'm looking forward to my restaurant people. Invitation to join your cool group then of people at some point.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm sorry, I can't find where you put your hand up. There's probably somewhere, and I'm probably breaching etiquette. Sorry, Rob. Can I ask a question, or is there anybody ahead of me?
Of course, go for it, Amanda. Yeah, no, go for it.
Yeah?
I'll ask mine afterwards.
So, just, Dawn, thinking about some of the stuff I know you've done and what you're talking about today, you've worked with OpenUK specifically on helping the diversity project we've undertaken in our new Code of Respect. How do you think the corporate citizenship helps with diversity in the community generally? And could you comment a little bit about diversity generally? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Just sort of taking
absolutely.
you a little bit further.
No, it's something I'm actually super passionate about. We really need to get people who've been underrepresented in tech, because that's the world we live in. Get people who've been underrepresented in the past and get more unique voices into the projects. So, my big focus is tends to be sort of on the inclusion side, which I think that if everyone feels like they're included, then I think it makes it easier to build a diverse community around, a project, a technology, whatever. And I do think that companies actually have a big influence in building the diversity within these open source projects. Because on the one hand, they can provide, dollars, right? They can provide sponsorship dollars to things like Outreachy, for example, which does paid internships for people who are underrepresented. I think it's a fantastic program, and I love to see things like that. So that's one way that companies can get involved, is they can sponsor things like that. Um, Another way that I think companies actually help is by, I look at VMware, and we have loads of people who are paid to work full time on open source projects, or nearly full time on open source projects. And I think that by paying people to do the work on open source projects, you end up with a bit more diversity than what you'd naturally have. Because if you rely entirely on volunteers, you end up with a whole bunch of people who have no family responsibilities, fewer other commitments, and you tend to sort of exclude people who tend to be, carers, tend to be the people who manage the families, which in our society tend to overwhelmingly, unfortunately, fall on the women. So I think that it helps get more people involved in some of these projects by having the companies be more involved and having their employees contribute. And then I do think things
Yeah,
like, codes of conduct are incredibly important. It makes people feel safe. They know that they've got a way to report something if something terrible happens. And so I think things like that are also incredibly important.
yeah, I absolutely agree with you. It's interesting. I hope that we'll be able to have a formalized outreach intern by the next run of them. It would be a great thing for Open UK to have. And absolutely on the paid piece. But I think there's another element sometimes we see with companies as well, which is because they have very clear obligations legally. I think sometimes they're more diligent than communities in making sure that they've a diverse employee base. And
Hmm.
I really hope that helps to make a difference too. But
Yeah,
thank you.
absolutely.
That's a great talk and a good answer to my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Unless there's any other questions, I have one final sort of comment to make about anybody else say anything now if you do want to ask another question. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and ask my one. But I just wanted to come back to that point you had about feedback on your slides. It's something that sounds so generic and that everyone should be thinking about feedback and not taking it personally. But I think it's really important, especially when it's in the tech sphere, when you're creating something, and it's very much a creative thing, perhaps more than something. Maybe being a lawyer is less creative, some people might argue. It's very easy to take it very personally about your code being insulted as such, or
Hmm.
your baby has been insulted. But that sort of creative, collaborative, people are just trying to make it better, and other people will have a different approach. It's a really important point that, yeah, it is applicable to nearly everybody's work, but people often forget about it or take it as a very personal attack. It's very easy to do so. Yeah, no, I particularly enjoy the cat picture because it is exactly that reaction that people have of just a hissing cat to, why are you saying this about my thing that I've made? So yeah, that iterative process, definitely. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard sometimes, right? I mean, the feedback and uh yeah, taking the feedback and doing something constructive with it can be really difficult. I mean, the one thing that we can all do to make that better is to be a bit more empathetic and kind when delivering our feedback, because it is easy to, you have 5 minutes for the next meeting. I mean, I'm a maintainer on projects, and sometimes I'm just like, I'll do a quick review on something and be like, oh no, not this, and they'll be like, oh no, maybe more words and not so harsh. But it's easy to do when you're trying to get somebody feedback quickly, and it's easy not to think about the niceties around it.
No, it's very true. Very true.
Yeah.
Cool. Unless there's any other questions, then thank you very much for your talk today. It's been really, really informative and useful, and it's been great having you here virtually to speak to us all today. And yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was really fun.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'll plug our next talk. Amanda, do you know who is up for our next talk?
Yes, indeed. So I'm going to say thank you to Dawn as well. And what she probably doesn't realise is that she's followed a very natural progression of stories that are available as recordings from these talks, both on the OpenUK website in our past events section, but also on our new YouTube channel, which we will sort of formally launch next week, but which is up there and already has followers. You follow hot on the heels of Matt Jarvis talking about community contributions from the community perspective. So it's been a really great balance. So thank you very much. It was an absolutely perfect talk in the progress of the series. And next week we start a few weeks looking at other areas, so open source hardware and open hardware and open data, which run us through to the end of July when we have a break in August. So next week we're going to welcome Andrew Katz, who we've had before and we all know well, and also Steve Helvey, who's a new speaker to us, who is the executive director of the Open Compute project. And between the two of them, they're hoping to span the open hardware environment from the sort of SAMI ARM end of it, I think, from the silicon through the devices and server based right to the end of the data center. So it should be a really interesting talk. So Dawn, thanks very much. Good to see you all and see everybody next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Cheers.
Bye.